Okay, welcome to lesson 25. In this lesson we're going to talk about argumentative research introductions. And this is the first of 3 lessons that looks at sample pieces of essays. You get an idea of what the final research essay should look like. So we have 4 objectives for this lesson. First, we're going to understand the elements of a strong research exposition or introduction. We're going to talk about what an exposition is in just a little bit. Second, we're going to review 2 sample research introductions and look at how they develop them. So after this lesson, I want you to complete Journal 7. So I mentioned Journal 7 in lesson 24. So after this lesson, I want you to complete Journal 7. So your Journal 7, I want you to find at least 5 sources and create a running outline that synthesizes those sources and gives an idea of the design of the essay. So create a running outline. And then I want you to write the first draft of your introduction based on what we talk about in here. Once you're done, I want you to email your outline and introduction to me at brooks.winchell@go.cambridgecollege.edu. So introductions. We talked about introductions at the beginning of the semester, and we said a good introduction leads the reader to the topic and presents the thesis. Those are sort of the goals of an introduction. This is the same for an argumentative research introduction. You still want to lead the reader into the topic and present the thesis, but for a longer research paper, introductions are typically more elaborate. Right? So it's best to think of an argumentative research introduction as an exposition of a topic. So an exposition sets the stage, right? If we think about the word exposition, it means, to show, basically. So an exposition to an essay sets the stage or shows the reader what's essential and gives the reader the necessary background that he or she needs in order to be able to read the essay. So for example, if we had the thesis, the U.S. should ban hydraulic fracking, that'd be a good idea, right? Who agrees with that? You probably are saying, I don't even know what hydraulic fracking is or why it should be banned. You haven't told me anything about hydraulic fracking. And you'd be right. So you can't just start with a thesis, especially a complicated thesis like this. With every single research essay, there's going to be some background or exposition that the reader needs to know before he or she hears the thesis. Right? So first we're going to need to know, what is hydraulic fracking? Okay, hydraulic fracking is the process by which gas companies force water down into a natural gas well in order to crack the well so they can extract more gas. So now you know enough, right? Should we ban hydraulic fracking? We probably still don't know enough. We probably need to know a little bit more about how it's done. Well, they take some heavy metal, water's filled with heavy metals, basically like a sludge, and force it down in order to get that crack. And that allows them to extract a significant amount of gas more. Well, this sounds like a pretty good thing. So I don't know why we would want to ban it. We don't really know what the controversy is. Okay, so we need to tell you why it's controversial. So this is a pretty controversial issue because when we're putting water with heavy metal into the ground, now we're basically putting waste into the ground. So there's environmental pollution issues along with other things that happen. So now we get a sense this is a very controversial practice. There are obviously some benefits and obviously some cons. So we're ready to hear the thesis, the U.S. should ban hydraulic fracking. So that's what you want to do in your exposition, is basically you tell the reader everything he or she needs to know so that they can understand it. So typically, expositions include the following elements. Definitions of key terms or phrases. No matter what your topic is, you're probably going to have some important term or phrase that you need to define. In the case of fracking, you have to define what fracking is. But in many other cases, you would need to define it as well. If we're doing a paper on racial profiling, we probably need to define racial profiling. If we're doing a paper on abortion, we probably need to define or explain what abortion is. If we're doing a paper on high school dropouts, we probably need to define what a high school dropout is. So definitions make up a key step in exposition. Histories are also important. Depending on what your topic is, a history could be really, really important. So like in the case of racial profiling, there's a pretty long history of racial profiling and laws against it. And we probably would need to discuss that history so we have the appropriate background and we know everything we need to know related to the topic. So histories can be an important part of exposition. Same with laws. They kind of go hand in hand with histories, but what kinds of laws have been passed related to this topic? Depending upon what your issue is. Like, so for abortion, what's the legality of abortion? Is it legal? Is it not illegal? What are some of the laws that have been passed along the way? And laws can be really important to help establish the right context, right? Finally, you might need some background statistics like numbers. If we're doing a paper on dropouts, how many people have dropped out? Drop out every single year, right? How many wells are fracked every year? That kind of background statistic can give us a good picture of the scope of the problem. So you always want to think of these when you're developing an introduction or an exposition. What are some key definitions, histories, laws, or background statistics that the reader needs to know before he or she hears the thesis and moves into your essay? Let's take a look at some examples. So for example, if our thesis was kids under 13 should not be allowed to participate in child beauty pageants, before we say this thesis, we probably need to define child beauty pageants, and we probably need to talk about the history of child beauty pageants and the current legality, laws, and the background statistics. How many child beauty pageants are there every year? If our thesis is drones should be banned in the U.S. airspace, we need to define drones. What are they? Talk about the sort of history, the rise of the drones, especially in the last couple of years, and how they've been more and more in U.S. airspace, and talk about some of the laws. The FAA did just recently pass a law on drones that bans them from certain areas, like over airports and stuff, and probably some background statistics. How many drones are there in the country? That kind of thing. So you can use these as a tool to help give you an idea of what should go into your intro. Last one, kids under 13 should not be allowed on Facebook. We need to talk about what Facebook is, maybe the history of Facebook, laws related to Facebook, or regulations, which is, I think they do have the regulation that kids under 13 should not be allowed on Facebook, and background statistics. How many kids under 13 do go on Facebook? That will help to give us a good, clear picture of the issue with the exposition before we hear the thesis. So let's take a look at two full-length sample argumentative research essay introductions, and I think that'll give you the idea of what it should look like. So let's start here with this one. So this is from an essay called The Inefficiency and Ineffectiveness of Racial Profiling and Its Negative Impacts on the Community, which is a pretty nice title too. We can see that this is obviously a paper against racial profiling before we start reading it. But let's take a look at the exposition in the introduction and see how the person develops his exposition. So he starts with the definition. Racial profiling, as per the definition provided by law in the United States, is, quote, any police-initiated action that relies on race, ethnicity, or national origin, and not merely on the behavior of an individual. And he got that from Klinning, 2012. Racial profiling has been a hot topic of debate ever since the infamous terror attacks of 9/11, claiming just under 3,000 lives. However, racial profiling before 1990, when terrorism began to rise, was a tactic used by common law enforcement in an attempt to prevent drug trafficking. The reason behind such a tactic was that as certain ethnicities are statistically more likely to commit certain crimes, focusing police resources on these groups would lower crime rates and thus increase police efficiency. So here we have a little bit of the history from Glaser. A common example of such an occurrence is during traffic stops. Minorities are more likely to be stopped and searched than whites. In fact, a minority driver is almost twice more likely to be stopped and searched than a white driver. So we got this from Glaser. So here's a really nice start. We can see how this person's using the tools. He has a good definition of racial profiling. He gives some background statistics on racial profiling and just uses it to discuss the history, basically how racial profiling happened after 9/11, but also how racial profiling has been used by law enforcement for some time now. But the introduction's not done there. He has a second paragraph in his introduction that starts here. Since the rise of terrorism, racial profiling has thus evolved and is now used in airports in instances of so-called random searches conducted on passengers. So here he's talking about the sort of current state of racial profiling to show us the controversy. Statistically speaking, the logic behind such reasoning is sound, and in a perfect world, racial profiling would arguably work if it were even necessary. But in reality, racial profiling is an ineffective means of preventing crime and, in addition, is morally unjust, as one should not be held responsible or suffer any consequences because some people of his or her racial group has committed a crime. Regardless of a few cases in which racial profiling has been effective, it should not be tolerated or implemented as a tactic used in law enforcement. So here again, he has a thesis. And this signifies the end of the introduction. He's against racial profiling, right? Despite the fact that it might be effective, it should not be tolerated. He uses the word should, not be tolerated or implemented as a tactic in law enforcement. So that tells us that he's done the intro. So in this case, he uses 2 paragraphs to present the exposition, and we feel pretty prepared to hear his paper. He's defined racial profiling. He's talked about the history. He's giving us some information on the controversy, right, since 9/11, and he gives us his thesis. So that's a pretty good example of an introduction. And this is probably about the length that yours might be. I would say between 1 and 2 pages at the most. Make sure that you end with your thesis. So that's not bad, but let's take a look at another example. Here's another example of an argumentative research essay introduction. This one's called Drop Out the Consequences. It's obviously about high school dropouts, and it was written for a much longer paper, the capstone, which is actually your final project. So this one's a lot more elaborate, it's a lot more involved. If we just sort of scan down, we can see that this one is about 3 pages in here, which is pretty long for an introduction. But for a paper that's 20 pages, it's a good length. Let's just read it, because I think this is a good example of a paper that uses the steps very well of the argumentative research introduction. So it starts here. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, 2010, 2,962,000 public school high school students and 311,000 private high school students are expected to graduate during 2010 through 2011. Today's American high schools consist of public, alternative, vocational, charter, and magnet schools. Ever since its origination over 150 years ago, the American high school's mission has been constantly shifting, beginning as a college preparatory institution, to taking on a socialization role, to adding workforce preparations, to modifying its curriculum by adding academic and vocational components. The purpose of American high schools now is to prepare all of its students from 9th to 12th grade for post-secondary schooling and training required for full economic and social participation in the United States society. So here, we know that the paper is going to be about dropouts, but she hasn't even mentioned it yet. She's just talking about high school. So she's really doing a good job walking us slowly into the essay, talking about high schools, how many there are, what are the purposes of high schools. Here in the next paragraph, she moves into definition. Although the role of high school is essential, many students choose to drop out. So she mentions dropout. One might wonder how a high school student is determined or considered to be a dropout. According to Hoffman, 2004, the National Center for Education Statistics, beginning in 1990, defined a dropout as an individual who was enrolled in school at some time during the previous school year and was not enrolled at the beginning of the current school year, and has not graduated from high school or completed a state or district-approved educational program, and does not meet any of the following exclusionary conditions: transfer to another public school district, private school, or state or district-approved educational program, including correctional or health facility programs, temporary absence due to suspension, or school-excused illness or death. So here she has a pretty elaborate definition of dropouts. And then here in the next paragraph, she moves on to talk a little bit about the laws. Furthermore, not all high school students can drop out. States set minimum and maximum compulsory age requirements to be in school. There are 24 states who have the minimum dropout age at 16 years of age. 9 states requires a student to be 17 years of age, and 17 states have the highest at 18 years of age. While no state has a dropout below 16, it's believed that the laws for dropping out have unintentionally and perverse consequence by facilitating students to discontinue their studies when they have only a year or 2 left to graduate. So here she gets it from this source, and we have laws. In the next paragraph, she moves into statistics and says, do you know how many high school students drop out every day? According to the Ad Council, about 7,000 students drop out every day. This means 1 out of every 3 high school students and equals 1 dropout every 26 seconds. In total, around 2.6 million students do not finish high school every year. If this trend continues, nearly 13 million high school students will drop out in the next 10 years. The Alliance for Excellent Education notes, 40 years ago, the United States of America was #1 when it came to graduation rates in the world. However, as of today, it's fallen to 19th place. So here she has statistics. And she has several different sources that she uses in here. She cites the Ad Council, she cites FSC Boston, she cites the Alliance for Excellent Education, and she cites Do Something. So she cites 4 sources in this one paragraph to give us several different perspectives on the issue and how big it is in the statistics. So nice statistic paragraph there. Then in this paragraph, she moves into even more statistics on demographics of who drops out. As a result, most dropouts tend to be males from families of low income. Ethnicity also plays a role in dropping out. Students who are Black, Hispanic, and Native American have higher dropouts than others. Students who are with unemployed parents, students with lower scores in cognitive ability, and also students whose second language is English are all likely prone to this fate. During 2007-2008 period years, the average freshman graduation rate for Blacks was 61.5%, 63.5% for Hispanics, and 64.2% for Native Americans. Rates also vary depending on the region a student lives in. For example, dropout rates are higher in the South and West than in the Northeast region of the United States. So here, more statistics about who drops out, right? So she's telling us who the dropouts are. They're, mostly Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans have very high dropout rates, which are particularly high. They're only graduating 61%, which means about 40% are dropping out. So good statistics there. And then after her statistics, she moves into her thesis paragraph. And here she says, the truth is there is not a single reason why students drop out of high school. However, in an article by Education Week's Kathleen Gwertz, the top reason why students drop out of high school was lack of motivation. Other reasons were students are not challenged enough, or they are overwhelmed by troubles outside of school. Classes were not interesting, not inspired to work hard, had to get a job to make money, started high school poorly prepared, had too much freedom, missed many classes, deficient basic skills, lack of engagement, parenting, getting along with teachers, suspension, expulsion, low grades, disliking school, school policies, caretaking responsibilities, and many others. So here, this is probably could be trimmed down a bit. There's a lot of reasons, but she's saying these are some of the reasons why they drop out, and then she moves into her thesis. The reasons are numerous, but high school students should not be allowed to drop out. So here's a clear thesis statement. She uses the word should not, right? She says high school students should not be allowed to drop out, and that tells us that she's reached the end of the intro. So a really nice example. I like this example a lot. It's long. It's 3 pages. I don't expect your intro to be 3 pages, but it really gives you an idea of those tools that I talked about. She has a clear definition. She has 2 paragraphs, or a clear explanation of the laws, and then she has 2 paragraphs on statistics to show us the problem. And then she has a thesis paragraph to end her essay. So there's another nice example of an argumentative research introduction or an exposition to a problem. So I think you can kind of use that as a model for yours. Well, let's flip back to the PowerPoint. So when you're researching for your topic, you want to consider your exposition as part of the research. You're probably going to look specifically for things related to the exposition. So if you know you're going to want definition, history, laws, and statistics, you're probably going to want to go to Google, right, and see if you can find some good definitions on Google related to your topic, depending on what you're doing. If you want to find some history, maybe you could type in, history of, Facebook, or history of fracking, and find a little history of it. Maybe you want to find some statistics. Maybe you could say number of fracked wells or something like that on Google and see if you can find some statistics. So you're going to have to do some research that it's specific to your exposition in order to be able to write this effectively. And I think that's a good place to start is by doing that on Google. Search for those definitions, histories, laws, and statistics related to your topic, and then you can write your introduction. So let's wrap it up real quick. So for argumentative research essays, expositions are really typical. The reader usually needs to know some kind of background, and that's what you're supposed to do when you write a research paper. So you give the author, the reader, some key definitions, history, laws, and statistics that lead the reader into the topic and allow that reader to listen to your thesis. So now we finished this lesson. I want you to complete Journal 7. So for Journal 7, I want you to research your question more and find at least 5 sources total and create a running outline of how you're going to write your essay. So synthesize those sources, create an outline, and then try writing the first draft of your exposition or your argumentative research introduction. So try to do that as soon as possible, and then email it to me at brooks.winchell@cambridgecollege.edu. I'll give you some feedback on your outline and your introduction, and after that you're going to be into writing the rest of the essay. And that's what we're going to talk about in lessons 26 and 27. Lesson 26 will talk about developing the body of the paper, your reasons and counterarguments, and lesson 27 will be a short lesson that talks about argumentative research conclusions. You can watch those as you're writing the essay, and then that'll be it. We'll be at the end of the course there. All we have left is a wrap-up. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you there, and send me your journal as soon as you can.